Welcome back to the channel, guys. Hope you're all doing exceptionally well. We're out here riding on this cold day to talk about what it is that I look for when purchasing a new electric bike. Because often on this channel, most of the time, I talk about upcoming bikes, I review bikes, I make buying guides, all that kind of stuff. But I was recently thinking that I don't remember the last time I told you guys what it is exactly that I look for when making a purchase decision myself. Because over the years, I've tested and built, oh gosh, I don't even know how many bikes. I mean, at least like 10, 15. And I've learned a lot along the way. Some of these points are going to be somewhat obvious, things I look for. Others, not so much. And they might even seem like small, kind of insignificant details. But from my experience, they do add up to amount to a better bike. So I think they're worth mentioning. But let's just get right into this. I'll begin with the most obvious, just to get out of the way. Power. After you get your first e-bike, you almost immediately crave more power. It's a mistake a lot of people make when they first get into the e-bike world. They want to begin cheap, kind of dip their toes into space. But everybody gets addicted. They want more power, and the same thing essentially happened to me. But I did kind of land on an acceptable power range, and I want to give you guys that figure now. So a quick disclaimer, there are lots of variables like the weight of the vehicle, the weight of the rider, but just generally, I found that I'm usually satisfied with a minimum of 2,000 watts. I've reviewed a ton of street legal bikes that are, technically 750 watts, but their real power is like 1,500 watts. And it's just not quite enough for me. But then I've had other bikes that have 2,000 plus, and for whatever reason, that's just like the sweet spot. My first ever bike build was 2,000 watts, and it was completely adequate. I enjoyed that bike a ton. My second bike build, I originally had it set to 1,500 watts, and it was okay, but it was never a fast bike. But towards the end of my tenure with that bike, I did go into the settings and change it to 2 kilowatts. And I mean, it made a huge difference. Now, before leaving the conversation around power, the other part of the conversation here is battery voltage. And ideally, I'm pretty much addicted to 72 volts at this point. So if it was up to me, I would go to 72 volts. 60 is okay if I was on a budget or had some other kind of constraints. But 52 volts, especially 48, down that range, that's just no longer something I'm personally interested in. Because again, I just know it doesn't have the power and the riding experience that I want at this point. Okay, for that one, the power, a pretty obvious thing to look at when going to buy a bike. The next one is not as obvious, but just as important. And that is the geometry of the overall bike. More specifically, the way that it's designed in 2 key areas. Do you see me? Yes. Okay, thank God. The first area is the suspension. The second is I guess you can call it the open space. So to touch on the first point, the geometry around the suspension, aka the linkage. This is crucial because, unfortunately, after purchasing a bike, you cannot go back and change the geometry. It's set in stone, and it's going to be the guardrails on what the bike is capable of. Any upgrades you do to it in the future, you're not going to be able to change the frame. And that was the big reason why I went from my second custom build to my third. It was the geometry of the frame in both of these aspects. So if you take a look at the rear linkage here on my P51, this has the best geometry if you care about a plush ride. It's very simple, and you can see that the shock is very close to the pivot point. It's also not elevated, like a lot of bikes tend to kind of bring the shock up and further away from the pivot point. This is right there. And again, this is the optimal setup for shock performance and magnification of the travel. An example of something that isn't as effective, at least generally speaking, is the rear geometry found in the Onyx RCR. This uses 2 shocks, which just adds cost if you ever want to change them out. And you can see that they're located far away from the pivot point towards the rear wheel, and that reduces the effectiveness of the shocks. And again, this is something that you cannot change after the fact. So geometry around the suspension is something to pay attention to. And then the second area geometry matters is the open spaces I was talking about. And again, the P51 bike I currently have is a great example of this. We can see the massive open triangle in the middle of the bike, as well as a flat space up top between the handlebars and the seat. And you can see how I utilized the space. I used it to attach extra batteries, which completely changed what the bike was capable of. Again, to give you guys a counterexample, my previous bike only had one spot that I could realistically fit a battery. So that was a limiting factor in the range of the bike. Now I could never add a second battery to it. But you don't have to just use the space for extra batteries. You could put frame bags and use it for storage, all things like that. So I would certainly pay attention to the frame and how it might be useful to you in the future. All right, moving right along here, the second major point I'm going to be touching on is the size. I've come to really appreciate smaller vehicles for a number of reasons. One is that they're more nimble, they're just easier to handle than larger, overly both heavy and just physically large bikes. A lot of us have limited storage space in our garage, so again, being smaller is just easier to store away when you're not using it. And to give you guys a little bit more actionable data here, I'll say focus on the wheels if you can. My very first e-bike was a mountain bike that I converted to with an electric motor. And I learned that mountain bikes have really huge wheels, and it made maneuvering the bike. I brought it to the city a couple of times on and off the subway, up and down escalators, and those wheels just made everything more cumbersome. And if you're not taking the bike off-roading on dedicated mountain bike trails, there's no benefit in having wheels that freaking massive. I would focus a lot more on the width of the tires because that has tangible benefits. I'm a huge fan of fat tires. They give you better grip on the ground, important for higher speed vehicles. And it also just gives you more comfort, where you have more of an air cushion underneath you. So my preferred pick here are 20 by 4 inch wide fat tires. I think that's the gold standard when it comes to e-bikes. Point 3 is maintenance. I like to minimize maintenance as much as possible. Another way of putting this is to have a bulletproof bike. And there's a couple of areas you could focus on to help you achieve this. The big one is the drivetrain. I've come to prefer hub motors because there's no chain involved. Less moving parts. Chains have a nasty habit of rusting really quickly if you don't do the proper maintenance. I will admit the maintenance isn't that hard. You just have to grease the chain every so often. But if I don't have to do that and worry about a chain rusting or even breaking and popping off the sprocket, that's better to me. And luckily, we have hub motors. The only complaint people have with hub motors is the lack of torque because they don't benefit from the gearing of mid-drive. However, they can easily overcome this just by raw power. Because unlike gasoline engines, they have all their torque from 0 RPM. They don't need to, spin up a certain level to be efficient. So I much prefer hub motors, but if you still want mid-drive, another way to help minimize maintenance is to get a belt drive. If you have that option, a belt drive is gonna last a lot longer, be cleaner, and require less maintenance. So when picking a bike, try to make it as bulletproof as possible. Another thing that falls in this category is a direct mount handlebar stem. This makes it so that way if you ever drop the bike or anything like that happens, you don't have to worry about the handlebars becoming uneven with the fork. That's super annoying when it happens. It's happened to me on every bike that isn't direct mount. But when you do have a direct mount handlebar stem, you just never have to worry about the alignment of your handlebars. Another thing that lowers the maintenance and makes it that much more bulletproof. The last thing I want to mention in this video is the bike that I'm currently on. I'm sure you guys have noticed that this is not your average bike. I can't talk too much about it right now, but a review is coming up very shortly on the channel. So make sure you are subscribed for that, because all I can say is that this bike is next level. It is absolutely insane, but I have a lot more to say about it in the full review. So I'll see you guys then, and peace out.